Hello, people. Today I want to talk about the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle is maybe a topic that is a little bit hard because the menstrual cycle happens in a few organs and a few hormones are involved. And this interplay of all of them together makes actually the menstrual cycle happen and makes a pregnancy possible. So a simple definition is that the menstrual cycle is basically a series of natural changes that happen in the ovary, in the uterus, and because of that it is divided. The menstrual cycle is divided into the ovarian cycle, so this would be the ovarian cycle, and later I will talk about the uterine cycle. So some changes happened in the ovaries and other changes happen in the uterus, and all of this is actually controlled via hormones, different hormones, and all of that enables and makes actually a pregnancy possible. So here I want to explain the ovarian cycle. So a part of the menstrual cycle are the changes that are happening in the ovaries, and these changes that control the production of an egg and the release of hormones out of the cells that are present, that is actually the ovarian cycle. And the ovarian cycle is just one part of the menstrual cycle. So before I start to talk about the ovarian cycle and what happens in the ovaries in detail, let's just see what is happening when we're talking about different hormones in a woman through her life. So if we look at this lower scale, so here are estrogen levels. So this scale is estrogen level, and these are years of life. So we can see that before puberty, hormone levels are very low. When puberty sets in, estrogen hormone starts to rise, and in the first year, this is representing the first years of puberty, the hormone levels, so the estrogen level is being set up. And after that, in the reproductive years, so until somewhere 45 plus minus a few years, when menopause is setting in, we have a constant level of estrogen being secreted. So it has its cyclic changes, but it is these changes are constant, and the estrogen is being pumped out regularly. At the end of a reproductive life, at the menopause level, these hormones that are produced by the cells of the ovary, so the ovary cells, when we come to the menopause, are stopping the production, and they are there is no biological possibility anymore for them to produce estrogen, and estrogen levels start to fall and menopause sets in. Between these years, in the reproductive years, these years are when we have the menstrual cycle. In these years, there is a possibility to achieve pregnancy. So this is estrogen levels, but estrogen is actually controlled via the anterior pituitary gland. So if we have here the hypothalamus, here would be the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary gland is producing follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So these hormones are actually called gonadotropin hormones. These hormones are the key for the start of estrogen production in puberty, because these hormones are secreted in a very, very low amount in children. And when we come to the time when children go into puberty, that is because the puberty sets in because this is starting to be secreted. And all the secondary sexual changes, the menstrual cycle in women, the sexual appetite, is because we start getting a signal. These gonadotropins are being secreted. Hypothalamus is controlling it. He says, I want now gonadotropins to be secreted, and they in turn in a woman start the menstrual cycle and puberty. So we see here, so if this are gonadotropin levels and these years of life, we see that the gonadotropin levels start to rise in puberty in both. This is for a female and this is for a male. So both in females and males, they start to rise, and they are constant. All in males, they are almost constant the whole life. They are a little bit higher here when we come to the older males. But we see that when menopause sets in women, we have a sharp increase in gonadotropins. That is because the ovaries can no longer produce estrogen and progesterone. When estrogen and progesterone are not secreted, so estrogen and progesterone have a negative feedback loop on the anterior pituitary. So if they are high, they will suppress the secretion of gonadotropins. If they are low, gonadotropins will be, the secretion of gonadotropins will be higher. That is what is happening here. So when menopause sets in, ovaries can no longer produce these hormones. They are spent biologically. And because of that, gonadotropins think there are no more estrogens and progesterone. I should be more active, if I can say that, and they are produced in a higher amount for some decades, and then they also start to fall because biological involution. So this is basically the elementary explanation. What happens with the basic hormones, gonadotropins and estrogen, in the life of a female? Now, we will see how actually the ovarian cycle is happening in the menstrual cycle. So the menstrual cycle has the ovarian cycle, which is one part of it, and the uterine cycle, which is the second part. What changes are happening in the uterus? So the changes that are setting in with puberty and lasting in the reproductive years of a woman in the ovaries are these. So every woman has a certain amount of primordial follicles in both of their ovaries. So these are primordial follicles. So every women have a certain amount of them in each ovary. Every month, so the menstruation begins. The beginning of a menstruation is the first day of a bleeding. When the bleeding subsides, every month, some of these follicles are being now stimulated, and I will explain that later. We will see how and what hormones influence these changes later. Now we will just see the anatomical happenings in the ovaries. What is actually happening? So under the follicle stimulating hormone, I will just say that this blue part is happening. So the follicle stimulating hormone is stimulating follicle development, hence the name follicle stimulating hormone. So at the beginning of a menstruation, some of these 6 to 12 of these primordial follicles start to develop. And they are starting to grow, cells start to divide, and some of them develop into the primary follicle. So the primary follicle is a bigger follicle that has special cells. These are called granulosa cells. These cells secrete hormones, estrogen, and later this follicle, if it is stimulated enough, only one of these, so there is a selection, only one of these develops, and then later develops into the secondary follicle that now has also granulosa cells, but also the outer lining of the follicle. The follicle has theca cells, and all of these cells are making the follicle bigger. The granulosa cells accept hormones, start producing fluid, and a small fluid small amounts of fluids are starting to accumulate, and that is called the antrum, and because of that this is also called an antral follicle. This follicle is then differentiating further into the last stage, the tertiary follicle. This is the last follicle, or also it is called the de Graaf follicle. This follicle now has a developed egg, a fluid in its antrum filled with many hormones, granulosa cells, and theca cells around it. And this is just before ovulation. So we see in the first part of the cycle, the follicle is developing under FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Then when we come to the 14th day, there is a big spike of luteinizing hormone that actually is needed for this structure to burst, to fuse with the wall of the ovary and then burst, so that the egg with some, so this is the egg. So the egg bursts out with some granulosa cells around it. So this is called the corona radiata, so basically the crown. And now, so this happens under a huge spike of luteinizing hormone. And this huge spike of luteinizing hormone enables that the rest of these cells develop into the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum is the yellow body. The yellow body produces high amounts of hormones and also high amounts of progesterone. And the yellow body, in the second part of the cycle, when the body is preparing the uterus for possible implantation, the corpus luteum is giving the hormones. But somewhere at the 25th day, if the cycle is lasting 28 days, what is the norm, the corpus luteum is shrinking, so it is using up its biological potential, and it will in the end become the corpus albicans, or the white body, which actually doesn't produce hormones, and it is just scar tissue that will be absorbed. And if there was no implantation of the egg, the cycle will begin again. So if there is no implantation, then everything starts again. So these are the changes and the explanation how this works in the ovaries. What are the changes in the ovaries? In the next part, we will see in detail the hormones. So in detail, the follicle stimulating hormone, the luteinizing hormone, progesterone, and estrogen, their possibilities. So the one quick repetition. So the follicles under the follicle stimulating hormone are starting to develop, producing high amounts of estrogen, the granulosa cells. Then the graph follicle under the luteinizing hormone that spikes somewhere in the middle of the cycle bursts and releases the egg with some granulosa cells. And under the luteinizing hormone, the rest of the graph follicle is turning into the corpus luteum. Then the corpus luteum secretes hormone until it becomes scar tissue. Thank you.